Well, thank you. It's, of course, a pleasure to be here this morning. And I was asked to talk a little bit about the outlook for the global economy, for policies. And I guess that sort of lends itself, as I think Steve was suggesting, to not necessarily the most upbeat presentation. But happily, not only did, as Steve said, that the European problem was solved overnight, but you probably saw the employment figures released this morning that showed at least a slightly better than expected outcome for job growth in the U.S. That perhaps points to a slight better than currently anticipated outlook, but I'll come to that. Well, let me get going so we can get the message out, and then Steve and I will have a bit of dialogue and perhaps take some questions. I have basically four messages I wanted to leave with you. First is, if you may recall, at the time of the unfolding of the financial crisis in 2008-2009, many, including at the IMF, made the observation that downturns, recessions accompanied by financial crises in the past had tended to lead to recoveries that were more protracted and slower than were otherwise the case. And the fact is, when we look at the data, look forward to the latest forecasts, it seems that unfortunately is proving to be the case here. We are in the midst of a protracted period of relatively weak post-crisis growth. And unfortunately, as we'll discuss in a second, it's likely to be with us for a while longer. At the same time, there are a set of near-term risks, and most of those risks, unfortunately, are to the downside. Only one significant risk to the upside, which I'll discuss. But more importantly, even going beyond these near-term challenges, we can look and clearly see that we are going to face, the global economy is going to face, a number of longer-term challenges that will be here for years to come. Well, the crisis of 2008-2009, in my view, on the one hand, made clear or laid clear the incoherence or the growing incoherence of the underlying international and even national institutions that were designed to govern economic and financial relationships both nationally and internationally. But that crisis produced a series of innovations that held out substantial promise of improved ability to manage economic growth and progress. I'm thinking in terms specifically of the creation of the Group of 20 at the leaders level, at the conversion of the Financial Stability Forum to the Financial Stability Board, the strengthening of the IMF, and the process of continuing to expand the World Trade Organization toward a global organization. Similarly, there were substantial innovations here domestically. Many of them are very controversial. The risk is that there is no follow-through or insufficient follow-through in cementing a more coherent and effective institutional arrangement to deal with financial, economic issues. The risk is that we will lapse in this situation of slow growth and significant long-term challenges back into a setup that seems more incoherent and less effective. And in fact, what concerns me is failure here could undermine the international economic and financial integration and the move towards more open global markets that has underscored the progress that we've made over the past 60 years in the post-World War II era, that for all its problems has represented the period of most rapid sustained economic growth and the most significant reduction in poverty worldwide that we have ever known. So it seems to me that the stakes are large, the challenges are fairly clear. But let me turn briefly to the outlook. I'll take as a benchmark the IMF's latest projections released on January 24th of their World Economic Outlook. I look back to the beginning of the crisis, 2008, and the new forecast goes through 2013. According to these figures, over that 6-year period, non-insignificant, global growth will have averaged 3.1%. The 20-year global average is 3.5%. The 30-year global average is 3.6%. In other words, this is not spectacularly, but not insignificantly below the long-term average. And even so, this means even after a period of 4 years of growth, post-recession growth, that global growth will not have recovered back to an average. And for the advanced economies, the situation is even much more clear-cut. Over that same 6-year period, growth in the advanced economies is slated, according to the IMF's figures, to have averaged barely 1%. For the U.S., just a bit more than that. And most notably, for the euro area economies, according to this forecast, which is pretty close to a consensus forecast, at the end of 2013, output, GDP, will barely be above the level registered in 2007. And even in Asia, the newly industrialized countries will have registered a growth rate of only 3.5% over that 6-year period. Emerging market and developing countries, 5.5%. And even China, which will have registered about 9% over that period, shows clear signs of slowing. So the picture is a very clear one. Sustained, sluggish growth, slow recovery from the downturn, and problems centered particularly in Europe. But even those areas that have been sources of strength are showing, not so surprisingly, signs of slowing down. What are the near-term risks? Well, the obvious one is Europe. And I will turn and talk about that in just a little more depth. The latest signs are hopeful, at least in terms of putting in place a plan to deal with the problems. But the economic data actually suggests a continued slowdown. And in fact, the consensus view in Europe, the consensus view is that this year will register a mild downturn in the euro area economy. Another risk is obvious that we face is the rise in energy prices that has been a reflection of the political turmoil in the Middle East region and potential security issues. Hard to discuss in terms, in analytical terms, but nonetheless, we can see that the risks are real. After all, it was a confluence of exogenous events, including the earthquake and tsunami in Japan, and the rise in energy prices last spring that knocked the pins out from under what looked like a strengthening global economy and led to a period of slowing global growth. And even in China, there are those who, well, first it's clear, and the Chinese authorities recognize that growth there has slowed from a very substantial double-digit pace to something under 9%. Relatively speaking, of course, that's quite good. But there are those voices that say the incredible rise in property prices in China is starting to unwind with uncertain effects as to how important that will be in slowing growth there. So the main point is that when we look at the significant near-term risks, that in general they are on the downside. Happily, in my view, if there is a positive risk, it strikes me that the U.S. economy is potentially in a situation that could produce not spectacular, but certainly stronger than currently anticipated growth, according to the conventional wisdom forecasts that suggest growth in the 2.5% range this year. Why? It seems to me, without going into details, that all the preconditions for a speed up in growth are in place. Strong corporate profitability, low corporate leverage, significant cash reserves, opportunities, and the principal factor that has been the source of weakness in the U.S. has been the weakness of consumer demand that has reflected the sluggish growth in real disposable income over the past year. And that's why the kind of data that we saw this morning that suggests finally the combination of job growth, extending average work week, and increase in hourly earnings that translates into an increase in, at least in nominal disposable income, points toward a prospect of rising growth, rising consumer demand in the U.S. Let's hope. Let me turn, I thought you might be interested at least in a quick view of what's going on in Europe. And because there seems to be general agreement that if there is a significant threat to the global expansion, it's a possibility of significant weakness, even greater than expected, in Europe. Here's the way I like to look at it. Let's ask the following. Do the Europeans have a plan to deal with their current situation? And here I think the answer is very clearly yes. And that plan can be found in the July 21st, last year's Euro Area Leaders Summit communique. In fact, it's explicit enough that it's set off in that communique in a box with 5 points numbered 1 through 5. What are the 5 points? 1, a sustainable solution for the Greek situation. 2, a firewall or financial backstop in summary terms for especially relevant for Spain and Italy. 3rd, recapitalization of European banks. First, in preference from private sources, if necessary from national sources, and if required from Euro-wide financial sources. Point 4, a program of sustainable and significant structural reform to improve productivity and growth prospects in the Euro area. And 5th, governance reforms that will help to avoid the kind of both imbalances and paralysis that have marked the last few years. So there's the plan. Seems to me, quick question. Would it work? If it were implemented in a convincing way, would it work? I think the answer is, at least to quell the crisis, the answer is yes. If that's the right answer, then the next question is it doable? Here again, we could discuss, but I think the answer is yes. And the final question, if it would work, if they did it, and it is doable, are they doing it? And here, in good European fashion, the answer is kind of, sort of. But I think that the difficulties of implementing these kind of programs reflects the difficulty of governance of the euro area. And that's a subject in itself. But it seems to me that the European leaders do understand what's at stake. And one way to view what seems to be very protracted negotiations and inconclusiveness of decisions is that this is really an argument about who is going to pay the costs of repairing the situation. Will they do it? Well, I think the answer is yes. Why? Again, I think about this in a relatively straightforward way. It's my impression, in part from having been living in London during the negotiations for the Maastricht Treaty back in the early 1990s, most people in Europe, most citizens of the euro area understand the logic of the single market. That as relatively small, isolated economies, they'd stand much less of a chance of success in the current global environment than they do with a single European market. Enough Europeans came to believe that you needed a single currency to sustain a single market. This is a controversial point, and even when the euro was agreed, it was not universally accepted. Nonetheless, enough agreed that it was done. To those kind of comments that say, but the euro area is not an optimal currency area, this is a big mistake, miss the dynamics of the situation. The Europeans knew that. They wanted to make the euro area an optimal currency area through integration and improvement in performance in the weaker areas. And those proponents for the single currency thought that the single currency was going to be the linchpin or the fulcrum for pressures that would cause it to occur. At the time, and frankly, that's what has failed. Now, at the time, that the Maastricht Treaty was negotiated, it's easy to forget that the conventional wisdom was that Germany was going to be the big loser and Spain and Italy were going to be the big winners. Germany was going to be hobbled by massive transfer payments to East Germany and a rigid labor market. Spain and Italy were going to benefit from a big decline in interest rates. 20 years later, it's assumed the opposite. Germany's been the big winner and Spain the big loser. So you need to think about what happened in the intervening 2 decades to change those views. And here it's clear the underlying issue is one of competitiveness. Germany undertook reforms, especially in their labor market, that improved their competitiveness, and their competitors did not. And that's how you got to the situation now. So in the discussion about Europe, don't get sidelined by the austerity show. All the discussion about is austerity too much, too little. The underlying issue is the fundamental reforms and competitiveness needed to make the euro area a sustainable economy under a single currency. The austerity, the budget debts, the deficits and debt are a byproduct of the loss of competitiveness, not the cause. And this is the underlying problem that needs to be addressed. So to view what's going on is simply trying to buy time to make those improvements. Are they willing to do it and can they do it? I've already said, I think the answer is yes. I think the principal risk is that the argument about who will pay will produce what I call a Wile E. Coyote moment, in which the protagonists are arguing among themselves and failing to notice they've gone over the edge of the cliff. I don't think that's going to happen. And I think the events of the last few days suggest that. But is it going to be easy? Absolutely not. Among other things, the actions of the ECB have been unprecedented. And as I'll remark in a minute, the actions of the key central banks, the systemic central banks, in the unprecedented amount of expansion that they have undertaken, have laid the grounds for a medium-term challenge. Well, that's Europe. I wanted to make a brief remark about the other area of note, of hope, and of risk, and that is the Middle East, North Africa region that has seen the dramatic events of the so-called Arab Spring, or whatever you wish to call it, and are producing substantial political, social, and potentially economic changes that could be helpful, could be hopeful, could be risky. But let me just give you the following economic perspective on how we got to where we are. For the oil importing countries of the MENA region, Middle East, North Africa, the oil importing countries, over the past 30 years, growth in per capita income has averaged 0.5%, 0.5% a year for 30 years. In the emerging markets as a whole over this period, growth in real per capita income has been 3% per year. In other words, this region has stagnated while the rest of the emerging markets, most of the emerging markets, especially in an aggregate sense, have forged ahead in a way that's unprecedented. Why has that happened? Well, it's not mysterious. For the rest of the emerging market economies, save the MENA oil importers, the share of world trade has doubled over that period. For the MENA countries, the MENA oil importers, their share of global trade has increased by 0. In other words, they have shut themselves off from the global economy. They have followed statist, state-dominated programs or policies, and the result has been stagnation in real per capita income at a time in which population growth in that region has been as fast as anywhere in the world, which is why you have this combination of weak per capita income growth and soaring rates of youth unemployment. Can something be done? Can it be done quickly? It means some very, very big changes. Can it be done peacefully? Let us hope. But it's going to require completely changing the orientation of economic policy with its social implications and political implications over the next few years. In Let me turn then to the long-term challenges. One, of course, is Europe. That it's one thing to say that Europe can get over the crisis and avoid disorderly financial or significantly negative results in the short run. But the real challenge is going to be reestablishing growth for this very large economy in the medium term. And this is going to require not just crisis prevention actions like we're seeing today, but sustained, fundamental, structural reforms to improve the efficiency of these economies. To be pessimistic would be easy, but once again, I refer you back to what I claimed earlier. 20 years ago, it was taken for granted that Germany was going to be the big loser because of their lack of competitiveness. And instead, Germany, if you will, took action, pulled up its socks, introduced reforms, and produced the kind of results that we see today. Can the rest of Europe do it? Why not? But it's a risk, because sustained weak growth in Europe would be a drag on the rest. Another area, and one allied that I just alluded to, and that is central banks have not only increased the size of their balance sheet in a dramatic way, but also have interjected themselves in financial markets in ways that has no precedent. The bankers assure us that when the time comes and economies normalize, they will be able to reverse those positions without causing either inflation or other financial disruption in economies. Can it be done? It's to be seen. They're confident they can. Have they convinced everybody? Not clear. This is, again, a topic in and of itself, but just to note that this is going to be a challenge. Allied with that is going to be the challenge of financial sector reforms. And it seems to me notable that an area where we know that today financial sector is not working effectively, is not working anything close to normal, and moreover is not going to return to exactly what it was before. When you say financial sector reform, most people hear regulatory reform. But regulatory reform is only one aspect of financial sector reform. Other aspects of equal importance are supervision, are resolution, and assessing the actual implementation of measures that have been adopted. The most difficult of all is the resolution of financial institutions operating in multiple jurisdictions. How the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy of what's really a medium-term to relatively small institution has caused repercussions across borders that are still not resolved today. I would say the progress on that area, how to deal with the potential failure of institutions operating in multiple jurisdictions, has been minimal at best. There's a lot to do. There's a lot to do in some areas, as I said, in terms of capital, of reassuring liquidity, avoiding deleveraging. This is a challenge that we cannot take for granted. The U.S. has made pretty good progress, but there are still big challenges in this area. And then this opens into the challenges that we all know that are not just the U.S., but in all the advanced economies, of unprecedented amounts of fiscal debt. At the same time, they're all facing unfavorable demographics and rising commitments to an aging population. Again, a theme we've talked about many times at this summit. But these are still to come and haven't been dealt with successfully. Finally, something to think about, and something that very little thought has been given to except a few. And at Stanford, people like Professor Ron McKinnon have been talking about this for some time. What if China does what it says it's going to do and starts to float its currency? What will the rest of Asia do? What are monetary arrangements going to look like in Asia? And what are the interests in Asia's trading partners? Not trivial challenges. So big challenges to come everywhere in the world. We need to be sure that there are institutions that are capable of coping with this. That's why the G20 was formed in the wake of the crisis, because it was obvious that the G7 simply was too narrowly cast to deal with it successfully. That's why the Financial Stability Board that was founded in the early 1990s to try to put greater coherence in financial sector regulation, supervision, and resolution was expanded to the Financial Stability Board to include all the members of the G20 and bring them to the table. The IMF was given more resources. The quotas have been rebalanced to better reflect the world realities, and structural changes were made to make it more effective decision-making process. And most recently, in the WTO, Russia is on its way to membership. So these are, in my mind, very positive reactions in an organizational, institutional way to the crisis that just befell us. But I worry that the political environment and the disappointment over the continued weakness of economic growth is leading to cynicism and dissatisfaction with these institutional innovations, and a tendency of those political authorities that created these innovations to at least quietly back away from them for fear that they are not politically popular. The risk is that we could find ourselves a year down the road, if this base case forecast is right, still facing weak growth, still facing near-term challenges, and still looking towards a panoply of significant longer-term challenges, but with a sense that the international response, which was coordinated and strong in the, most notably at the London G20 summit in April 2009, has dissipated into everyone watching mainly for themselves. If there's not recognition of support of this need for coherence and seriousness in policymaking, this period of extended slow growth could even extend further or worse. It's important to pay attention to these challenges and the institutions needed to produce a coherent international response. So it's important that people like you pay attention and pressure your authorities to act in a responsible and effective way. Thanks very much.